She was peeling potatoes behind someone else's hotel when he found her. Not because she wanted to be found. Because she'd run out of choices 11 weeks ago and made the only decision that kept her from starving. And then, quietly, without a single word of warning, she made it again. Dark. Silas Calder stood at the corner of that alley, holding a leather ledger that his 7-year-old daughter had filled with the most devastating accounting he had ever seen in his life. $99 in his coat pocket. A bank deadline in 31 days. And the woman he had let work herself half to death, standing in the cold, peeling potatoes for someone who actually paid her. He had sent 6 men across every street into Dry Creek to find her first. If it were you, would you have gone back? If this is the kind of story that stays with you, the kind that makes you someone you knew, the kind that makes you sit still and think about us or maybe someone you were, please subscribe to this channel right now and follow along to the very end. Stories like this one don't come around often, and I'd hate for you to miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Lenora Vance arrived in Dry Creek, Wyoming territory, she had exactly $11.42 folded inside her left boot, a leather trunk that weighed more than it had any right to, and a letter of employment that was already 3 months out of date. She had read that letter so many times on the train, the ends had worn soft, and the ink along the bottom ends had smeared from the sweat of her fingers. Position of cook secured. Report no later than September 15th, 1,884. Accommodations provided. Wages $8 per month. Signed by a man named Prouty who, she would later learn, had watched his hotel burn to the ground in July and never thought to write her a second letter canceling the first. She stepped the rail platform into a wind that cut straight through her wool coat and stood there a moment with her trunk beside her, looking at the town. Dry Creek was the kind of place that had been named by someone who understood exactly what it was and didn't feel the need to pretend otherwise. 2 long streets of wooden storefronts, most of them unpainted. A livery at the far end. A church with a crooked cross on top that looked like it had been struck by lightning and no one had fixed it. And where the Prouty Hotel should have been, according to the letter, according to every plan she had made since leaving Cincinnati in October, there was a black charred lot with weeds growing up through the ash. Lenora stood at the edge of that lot for a long time. 31 years old. She had spent the last 8 years working in other people's kitchens, once in a hospital laundry in Pittsburgh, that she did not like to think about. She had no husband. She had no family left to wire money to her. She had the coat on her back, the trunk at her feet, the $11 in her boot, and a letter from a man whose hotel no longer existed. The nearest train back east left on Thursdays. Today was a Monday. She did the arithmetic, standing at that charred lot, the way she always did arithmetic, quickly and without sentiment. Train fare back to Cincinnati, more than she had. Train fare to Denver, more than she had. Renting a room in Dry Creek, while she found another position, $8 a week minimum, which meant she had approximately 10 days before she was sleeping outside. 10 days. She picked up her trunk. She had not come this far to stand in front of a burned lot and cry. Problem with Dry Creek was that it was small in the way that made everyone's business visible. By noon on that first Monday, 3 different people had told Lenora about the fire, 2 had offered her sympathy that cost them nothing, and one the woman who ran the rebuilt hotel at the end of the main street. A sharp-eyed woman named Clara Wexley had looked her over from hat to boots and told her there were no positions available, but that she should check back in the spring. Spring was 5 months away. Lenora did not say any of the things she was thinking. She thanked Clara Wexley, picked up her trunk, and walked back out into the street. She spent the next 2 hours asking at every door she could find the feed store, the dry goods merchant, the livery, the small eating house near the rail station that smelled of rancid grease and employed its owner's wife and nobody else. She had experience in kitchens, she said. She could preserve smoke and salt. She knew how to manage a pantry and keep accounts. She had good references from her last position in Indiana. Nobody needed her. At 4 in the afternoon, she walked into the only saloon that appeared to also serve food, sat down at a table in the corner, and ordered a bowl of beef stew that cost 15 cents and tasted like regret. She sat there and thought very carefully about what came next. What came next was this. She had to get out of Dry Creek by Thursday, and she had to find work before Thursday in order to afford to get anywhere. If she could not find work in Dry Creek, she needed to look outside Dry Creek. County had ranches. Ranches had households. Households needed managing, especially through winter, and especially she had learned this from years in other people's employ in houses where there was no woman to run them. She asked the man who brought her stew about the ranches in the county. He named 6 of them. He said 2 were doing well, 3 were struggling, and 1, Iron Hollow, out on the North Road, about 6 miles past the town boundary, was in what he called a bad way. Widower running the place. 2 hard winters back to back. He'd heard the bank had them by the throat. Lenora finished her stew. She slept 12 cents on the table because she could not afford to leave 15. She went to the rooming house where she had stored her trunk and paid for one night, with money she didn't have to spare, and sat on the narrow bed in the dark and thought about that word, widower, and what it usually meant for a household and what it might mean for her. At 5:30 in the morning, before the town was awake, she hired the only man at the livery willing to haul her trunk on a wagon for 50 cents and told him to take her out on the North Road as far as a ranch called Iron Hollow. The man looked at her the way people had been looking at her for 2 days, like she was a problem that had wandered into the wrong county. But he took her 50 cents and hitched the mule and drove her out. He left her at the gate, not at the house at the gate. The gate was a tall wooden frame with the words Iron Hollow burned into a crossbeam overhead. Beyond it, a wagon track cut through brown grass for what looked like half a mile before reaching a cluster of buildings in the distance. The man with the mule pointed at the buildings and said that's it, and turned around and drove back the way he came. Lenora stood at that gate in the early morning cold with her trunk and looked at those a half mile and understood, for the first time, the complete reality of what she had done. She was standing on someone's property without an invitation. She had no letter, no reference, no appointment, no guarantee that whoever was inside those buildings had any use for her or any ability to pay her, even if they did. She had 53 cents left, not counting what was in her boot, and she was 6 miles outside a town where nobody wanted to hire her. She dragged the trunk through the gate. It took her almost 20 minutes. The trunk caught on ruts, and the handle dug into her palm, and she had to stop 3 times to rest her arm. The grass was frosted, and her boots were not made for rough ground. By the time she got within 100 yards of the house, she was sweating despite the cold, and her hair had come half out of its pins, and she was breathing in a way she didn't entirely control. She was sitting on her trunk, catching her breath, trying to decide how to present herself to whoever came out of that house, when she heard the front door open. She looked up. A small girl stood on the porch steps looking at her. She was maybe 6 or 7 years old, with dark brown hair in 2 braids that had been done by someone not practiced in the doing of braids, because one was tighter than the other, and both had begun to fray. She wore a coat that was too large for her, probably handed down from someone, and she was holding a plate covered with a cloth. The girl walked down the porch steps and crossed the yard toward Lenora without hesitation, the way children sometimes do when adults would stop and recalculate. She stopped 3 feet away and held out the plate. "Daddy said, 'Don't talk to strangers,'" she said, "but I figured you looked hungry." She pulled back the cloth, a thick slice of cold beef and 2 pieces of cornbread. Lenora looked at the plate. She looked at the child. She had not eaten since the bowl of stew the previous afternoon, and she was so hungry that her hands had been shaking for the last hour, though she had been trying not to notice. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Maisie," the girl said. "I'm Lenora." Maisie nodded like this settled something. She sat down on the ground beside Lenora's trunk, apparently prepared to wait, while Lenora ate. She was halfway through the cornbread when the second door opened. Silas Calder came out of the barn. Not the house, she hadn't been watching the barn, and he was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. Dark. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been left out in wind, and cold, long enough that the lines in it were not the lines of age so much as weather. He walked toward her with the direct, unhurried movement of a man who had learned not to waste motion. He looked at her. He looked at Maisie sitting in the frost. He looked at the trunk. "Maisie," he said, "go back inside." She looked hungry, Maisie said without moving. "It's inside." Maisie went, but slowly. Silas looked at Lenora. She was standing now, the plate in her hands, her hair half down, her coat dirty from dragging the trunk, trying to look like a woman who had a plan and not like a woman who had eaten a stranger's cold beef because she was running out of choices. Private land, he said. I know, she said. I apologize for arriving this way. My name is Lenora Vance. I came from Cincinnati with a letter of employment to the Prouty Hotel. The hotel burned. I've been in Dry Creek 3 days, and I can't find work, and I'm told you run this ranch without a cook or a housekeeper. He said nothing. I'll work for no wages until spring, she said. Room and board. If the ranch is still standing in April, you pay me then. If it's not, you owe me nothing. The silence that followed was long enough that she counted it. 8 seconds. 9. Who told you 'twas ranch struggling, he said. A man at a saloon. Which man? I don't know his name. He brought me stew. Something shifted in Silas Calder's face, though she could not read exactly what it was. He looked at her trunk. He looked at the gate, half a mile back, which she had clearly come through on foot with that trunk by herself. You dragged that from the gate? He said yes. He was quiet again. Not the silence of a man thinking about whether to help her, she thought. The silence of a man who had already made a decision and was just looking at the problem one more time before he committed to it. There's a room off the kitchen, he said. It's not much. It'll do, she said. I can't promise April. I know. He picked up one end of her trunk without being asked. She took the other end. They carried it to the house together, which was not how she had imagined this moment going, but then almost nothing about the last 72 hours had gone the way she imagined. Inside, the kitchen was cold. That was the first thing she noticed, not cold from the weather, but the particular cold of a room that had been neglected, where the fire had gone low and nobody had bothered to bank it properly. Dirty dishes were stacked in a way that suggested they had been there since the night before, possibly longer. There was a grease spot on the wall behind the stove that had been there long enough to darken. The pantry door was open, and she could see from where she stood that the shelves were badly organized. Things pushed to the back where they couldn't be seen, flour next to lamp oil, dried beans in a sack sitting directly on the damp floor. She said nothing about any of it. She put her coat on a hook and rolled up her sleeves. She found the wood box first, then the kindling. Then she built the fire back up the right way low, and even the kind of fire that would hold all day without constant tending, and she put the kettle on, and she started to learn what she had gotten herself into. What she had gotten herself into was worse than she'd expected, and she had not expected anything good. There were 6 ranch hands eating out of this kitchen, in addition to Silas and Maisie. That was 8 mouths, twice a day, sometimes 3 times when the work was heavy. The last woman who had managed this kitchen was Silas's wife, who had died 18 months ago from a fever that moved fast, the way fevers in this country sometimes did. Since then, the cooking had been split between whoever had time, which meant it had mostly been terrible and had often been beans. Lenora discovered this the first evening when she served supper. She had found enough in the pantry to make a proper pot of stew, real stew, with the beef she found hanging in the cold room and the half-shriveled carrots and the potatoes pushed to the back of the bottom shelf. Not a feast, but food that tasted like someone had paid attention to it. The 6 ranch hands came in at dusk, men ranging from a young boy of about 17 to an older man with a gray beard named Reuben, who looked like he had been sitting on this land since before the territory had a name. They washed at the pump outside the way men do when washing is a habit and not a pleasure, and they came in and sat down. They ate without speaking for a long time. Then the older one, Reuben, put his spoon down and looked at her across the table and said, "Ma'am, this is the best thing I've eaten since March." March was 7 months ago. Lenora said, "Thank you," and carried dishes back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment in the dark before she lit the lamp. She had made it to the next day. That was all she could think about right now. She had made it one more day. Silas Calder came into the kitchen late that first night after Maisie was asleep, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse. He had the ranch ledger under his arm, and he stood at the kitchen table, and she could see, even without asking, that the numbers in that ledger were not good numbers. He had the look of a man who checked the same column of figures every night, hoping they would be different, and they never were. He didn't say anything about the ledger. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left on the stove, and he stood there, drinking it, and she was cleaning the last of the supper dishes. And they didn't speak for almost 10 minutes. Then he said, "The hands ate tonight." "They did," she said. "Usually, someone's complaining by the time supper's done." Nobody complained. No, he said. They didn't. He finished the coffee and set the cup down and went back to his study with the ledger. Lenora wiped the last dish dry and looked at the kitchen. Fire was banked right. The dishes were done. The floor wasn't clean, but it was cleaner than it had been that morning. Tomorrow she would deal with the floor. The day after, the pantry. She was tired in a way that went below her bones. But she had made it one more day. Tomorrow she would make it one more. That was what surviving looked like, she had learned. Not a plan, not a destination. Just one more day, and then another, until enough of them stacked up that you could start calling them something else. She went to her room off the kitchen. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she took the $11 out of her boot, still folded, still, her only real thing, and she held it for a moment. Then she put it back. She needed to keep it a while longer. She wasn't sure what she'd need it for. But a woman in her position kept what little she had until she understood the ground beneath her. Most of its windows were dark. Outside, the Wyoming wind picked up and moved through the eaves of the old house with a sound like the building was trying to tell her something. She didn't know yet what Iron Hollow was going to ask of her, but she had a feeling it was going to ask for more than she planned to give. She lay down without undressing. She was asleep in under 3 minutes. She woke up that second morning before anyone else at Iron Hollow, which was not an accident. She had done the arithmetic the night before, lying on that narrow bed, listening to the wind work through the rafters, and she understood that her only value here was what she could demonstrate. Before Silas Calder had time to reconsider his decision. A man who had agreed to take on an extra mouth to feed out of something between pity and pragmatism could just as easily change his mind. And Lenora Vance had not dragged her trunk 6 miles through frost to get turned out in the first week. So she was up at 4:30, fire built before 5. Coffee on, before the first of the hands stirred in the bunkhouse. When Reuben, the oldest hand, pushed open the back door at 5:40 and found the kitchen already warm and a pot of oat porridge on the stove and fresh coffee waiting, he stopped in the doorway and just stood there a moment, like a man who had walked into the wrong house. "You sleep at all?" he said. "Enough," she said. He poured his coffee and sat down without another word. But he was watching her in the careful way of someone taking inventory, the way men who had been on the land a long time watched weather and animals and anything new that appeared in their territory, not suspicious exactly, just calibrating. The second morning set the pattern. The third confirmed it. By the end of the first week, the kitchen at Iron Hollow had become a different room. Not because Lenora was a better cook than the situation deserved, though she was, but because she worked the kitchen the way you work a problem that cannot afford to stay unsolved. She was up before the household. She banked the fire the right way so it held without constant feeding. She watched what came back on plates and what didn't, and she adjusted, because a kitchen that wasted food was a kitchen bleeding money that a ranch like this one could not afford to lose. On the 4th day, she opened the pantry and spent 3 hours pulling everything out and starting over. What she found was dispiriting in a very specific way. It wasn't that the pantry was empty, it was that it was full of things that had been allowed to become useless. A full bushel of potatoes had been pushed so far to the back of the bottom shelf that they'd gone soft in the dark, and half of them had already started to rot. 3 pounds of dried beans were in a cloth sack sitting directly on damp floorboards, which meant another month and they'd have been moldy straight through. There was a tin of lard that hadn't been sealed properly. Cornmeal in a container that something mice probably had gotten into from the bottom. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her inventory list and felt the particular frustration of waste. Not the waste itself, waste happened, especially in a house without a woman to catch it, but the arithmetic of what it represented. Every rotted potato was money. Every spoiled pound of meal was money. A ranch that was already strangling on debt could not afford to let its food dissolve in the dark. She separated what was salvageable from what wasn't. The soft potatoes that hadn't gone rotten yet, she put in a separate basket and used them first. The beans she moved into a proper tin container and put on a dry shelf. The lard she rendered down and resealed. The mice in the cornmeal had a different problem that required a different solution, and she found the ranch cat and sleeping behind the woodpile and brought it inside and let it sleep near the pantry at night, which solved that particular issue within the week. Silas saw her pulling everything out of the pantry on that 4th day. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work, and she braced for him to ask what she was doing to his kitchen. But he didn't say anything. He watched, and then he left, and she didn't know until later what he had taken from it. The thing about Iron Hollow's waste was that it wasn't stupidity. It was grief. She understood this gradually, over the first 2 weeks, the way you understand something by accumulating small pieces until they form a picture. Silas's wife had died 18 months ago. Her name was Ruth. Lenora didn't learn this from Silas. She learned it from Maisie, who said it the way a child says the name of someone they are still actively trying to understand the absence of. Ruth had run the household. Ruth had known where things were and what they cost and how to make a sack of flour last through a hard week. When Ruth died, the household didn't stop ranches. Can't stop. The cattle don't care who's grieving, but it lost its center. The 6 ranch hands had kept the operation functioning in the roughest sense. They fed themselves. They kept the stove from going out. But none of them knew how to run a kitchen the way Ruth had, and Silas was dealing with debt and cattle prices, and 2 brutal winters, and the private business of raising a daughter alone, and nobody had the bandwidth left over to notice that the pantry was slowly consuming itself in the dark. Lenora did not say any of this to anyone. She just fixed it. On day 9, she found a garden plot behind the house that had been abandoned. It was too late in the season to grow anything. The first hard frost had already come, but she could see from the dead stalks and the turned soil what had been there. Squash, beans, turnips. She found 3 turnips still in the ground that the frost had missed, small ones but edible. She dug them up herself and washed them at the pump and put them in the pot that night. When she brought the pot to the table, Maisie looked at it and said, "Those are from Mama's garden." Lenora hadn't known that. The table went quiet in the way tables do when a child says something that hits all the adults in a place they weren't protected. "Yes," Lenora said after a moment, "she planted them well. They kept." Maisie thought about this. Then she picked up her spoon. Nobody said anything else about it, but Silas looked at Lenora across the table in a way that was different from the way he'd been looking at her all week. Not quite gratitude. Not quite something else, just a long look that she held for a moment before she went back to passing the bread. The bread was another thing. Iron Hollow had been buying bread from the dry goods merchant in town, pre-made loaves, at a price that, when she calculated it over a month for 8 people, made Lenora press her lips together to keep from saying something out loud. She started baking her own in the 2nd week. The flour from the ranch's existing supply, water from the pump, salt, the rising thyme she handled around her other work. It cost a fraction of what they'd been spending. It was better, and it was hot, which the town bread never was. Reuben ate his first slice of her bread on a Tuesday morning and sat in silence for a moment before he said, "That man at the dry goods store sold Silas terrible bread at a price that ought to have shamed him." "Well," Lenora said, "I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." He had a way, Reuben did, of making observations that were really questions, letting things hang in the air until someone picked them up. She'd started to like him for it. He was honest about things without being aggressive about it, which was rarer than people understood. It was Reuben who told her about the flour. She had been buying, or rather, Silas had been buying before her arrival flour from the dry goods merchant in town, which was the nearest and therefore the most expensive source. Reuben mentioned one afternoon, with the same level tone he used for everything, that there was a mill about 40 miles east that sold bulk flour to several of the larger ranches in the county at some considerably lower prices, if a person could arrange a quarterly contract and provide their own transport. "How much lower?" she said. He told her. She did the arithmetic right there while standing at the sink, and the number she came up with for annual savings was significant enough that she put the pot down and looked at Reuben directly. Why hasn't Silas done this already? Reuben was quiet for a moment, because nobody's had the time to sit down and figure out that the numbers add up. And because the merchant in town is Frank Detweiler, and Silas owes Frank Detweiler some money on a previous account, and it's awkward. Does the mill require payment through the town merchant? No. Then it's not awkward, she said. It's arithmetic. Reuben almost smiled. She had noticed he almost smiled fairly often, in the way of someone who had decided long ago that the world was something to observe rather than react to. "You want me to find out who to write to at the mill?" "Yes," she said. "Please." She brought the proposal to Silas that evening. She did not ask him, because she had learned in her first 9 days that Silas Calder responded better to information than to requests. She put the numbers on the table. She put the numbers on the table literally. She wrote them on a piece of paper, and she showed him what the ranch was currently spending on flour per month, and what of its windows were dark, and what the same amount of flour would cost from the Eastern mill on a quarterly contract, and she put the difference at the bottom of the page and let him look at it. He looked at it for a long time. There'd be the cost of transport, he said. Jake takes the wagon to the East County every 6 weeks for fence supplies, she said. The mill is 12 miles past the lumber yard he already stops at. He looked at the paper again. Frank Detweiler's going to notice, he said. Yes, she said. He is. Silas rubbed the side of his jaw with his hand. A gesture she had already learned meant he was processing something that bothered him socially, even if he agreed with it logically. Frank Detweiler, Frank Detweiler, and the awkward accountant was something she fully understood yet. But she understood enough to know it was a real consideration and not just Silas being difficult. The account with Frank, she said carefully. Is it large? Manageable. Would switching the flour contract affect it? It would affect Frank's feelings about it. She nodded. Then manage Frank's feelings separately. The flour is flour. The arithmetic doesn't care about feelings. He looked at her then with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not irritation, not agreement. Something between the two that lived in the territory where a man was being told something accurate that he already knew and was not entirely comfortable having confirmed by someone else. I'll write to the mill, he said. Good, she said, and picked up the paper. She was at the door of his study. When he said her name, not Lenora, just Miss Vance, which was what he had been calling her since the first day, turned. The potatoes you found in the pantry, he said. The soft ones, yes. Those should have been caught 2 months ago. It was not an apology. Silas Calder did not appear to have a quick and easy relationship with apologies. But it was something, and she understood it to be something. They were caught now, she said. That's the thing about catching things. It's better late than not at all. She went back to the kitchen. Maisie was at the kitchen table when she returned, supposedly doing her school work, but actually watching Lenora with the focused attention of a small person who was making up her mind about something. She had been doing this for most of the second week. She would sit within eyeline and watch without appearing to watch, the way children do when they're trying to figure out if someone is going to stay. Do you know long division? Maisie said. Lenora looked at the paper in front of her. Yes, Daddy tries, but he mixes up the steps. Bring it here. Maisie carried the paper over and stood beside her at the counter while Lenora walked through the problem. She showed her each step once, then had Maisie try the next one herself, which was how Lenora had been taught, not by watching, by doing. Maisie got it wrongs were dark. Maisie got it wrong the first time and right and said nothing, but stood up a little straighter. Can you show me another one? Maisie said. Write it out. I'll be here. Maisie went back to the table. It became a quiet routine. Maisie at the table with her school papers, Lenora moving between the stove and the counter, helping when asked, not making a production of it. These were the easiest hours of Lenora's day. Those late afternoon hours when the kitchen was warm from the stove and Maisie was working and nobody needed anything dramatic from anyone. It was during one of those afternoons in the third week that Lenora came back from the cold room with a side of beef she'd been planning to salt and discovered that Maisie had moved her things. Not all of her things. Just one thing. Lenora had a drinking cup, a plain tin cup she'd carried from Cincinnati, the kind of cup that had no sentimental value except that it was hers and she'd had it a long time. She had been keeping it on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet, the left side, where she'd made a small for it, next to the coffee tins. It was not there anymore. She looked around the kitchen. Maisie's windows were dark. E was watching her from the table with an expression that was carefully neutral in the specific way of a child who has done something they are not entirely sure was permitted. Lenora followed the logic of where a 7-year-old might put something, and she opened the cabinet on the right side. The section of shelf that Silas had once pointed out held things belonging to the household, the ranch's mugs and cups, communal property. There was her tin cup, sitting on the shelf between 2 other cups. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she looked at the other cups more carefully and understood what she was looking at. And the cup in the center was not a ranch mug. It was a different thing entirely, a proper ceramic cup with a small painted flower on the side, the kind of cup someone had brought from somewhere else, carried carefully because it mattered. It had the quality of an object that had not been moved in a long time. The kind of thing you keep exactly where it is, because moving it would mean acknowledging something. Ruth's cup. Maisie had put Lenora's tin cup beside Ruth's ceramic cup, not replacing it, not instead of it, beside it. Lenora stood at that cabinet for longer than she should have. She could hear Maisie behind her, very still at the kitchen table, waiting. She took her tin cup down. She filled it with coffee. She put it back on the left shelf where it had been originally and went back to the beef she'd come in for. "Miss Lenora," Maisie said. "I see it," Lenora said quietly. "I see it, Maisie." Maisie didn't say anything else. She went back to her long division. But Lenora stood at the counter and worked with her back turned for a while, because there was something burning in the back of her throat that she needed to give a moment to subside, and she was not the kind of woman who cried in other people's kitchens. She moved her cup to the right shelf before she went to bed that night. She didn't make anything of it. She just moved it. By the end of the third week, the ranch's food costs had fallen enough that Silas mentioned it without being prompted, which for him was the equivalent of an enthusiastic endorsement. He said in the same flat tone he used for most things that the numbers for November were looking different from October. "The preserved beef helps," she said. "The whole thing helps," he said. All of it. It was the closest he had come in 3 weeks to saying that having her here was a good idea. She accepted it with a nod and didn't push at it, but she noted it. The ranch hands had begun to change in ways that were small but real. Reuben had taken to giving her a brief report each morning of what the day's work would be, so she could plan meals around when people would need the most fuel-hard outdoor work, needed different food than repair work in the barn, and she could calibrate accordingly. Jake, the youngest hand, had started leaving firewood stacked inside the kitchen door without being asked, which saved her the trip to the woodpile in the cold. A man named Dell, who had never once spoken to her directly in the first week, now said thank you every evening at supper, every single evening, without fail. Small things. The kind of things that don't seem like much until you understand that a household is made entirely of small things accumulated. Then the trouble came. She had been at Iron Hollow for 38 days when she walked into town with Maisie to pick up the weekly supplies that still had to come from Dry Creek's dry goods store, not Frank Detweiler. There was a second smaller merchant who sold certain things more reasonably, and she ran into Clara Wexley. Clara was coming out of the post office, and Lenora was going in, and the meeting was unavoidable. Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been tracking information and had now found the source. "You're still at Iron Hollow," Clara said. "Yes," Lenora said. "It's been over a month, 38 days," Lenora said, because she had been counting, and she didn't see the point of pretending otherwise. Clara glanced at Maisie, who was standing beside Lenora holding the supply list and looking at the sidewalk. Clara had the good sense to drop her voice, which Lenora appreciated. "Come have coffee with me," Clara said. "The girl can wait at the counter. I'll have Jessie give her a biscuit." It was the kind of invitation that wasn't entirely an invitation, and they both knew it. Lenora left Maisie at the hotel counter with a biscuit and a cup of warm milk that's across from Clara Wexley in the small office behind the hotel kitchen and listened to what Clara had to say. What Clara had to say was, on its surface, practical. She had a position, $12 a month, private room with a lock on the door, regular hours, and every Sunday afternoon free. Her hotel was the only one in the count since Mr. Prouty burned, and she was doing enough business to afford good help, and she intended to keep it that way. "That's a generous offer," Lenora said. "It is," Clara agreed. "And you know it." Lenora did know it. $12 a month was more than the 8 she'd been promised at the Prouty, and unlike the Prouty, this hotel was not on fire. Regular wages, a locked room of her own, the kind of security that a woman alone in the Wyoming territory understood as something not to be taken lightly. "I have an arrangement at Iron Hollow," she said. "You have an arrangement," Clara repeated, and the word in her mouth had a particular texture to it. "You've been cooking and keeping house for a widower for 38 days, and you haven't been paid. I'll be paid in April." Clara looked at her steadily. She was a practical woman, Clara Wexley, not unkind, but practical in the way of a person who had built something from very little and knew exactly what that required. "Lenora, I've been in this county 11 years. I know what Silas Calder's situation is. I know what that bank is doing to Iron Hollow. And I know that a man who can't make his own loan payment isn't in a position to pay anyone anything in April, regardless of what he intends today." The words landed. Not because Lenora hadn't considered them. She had. She had turned the mathematics of Iron Hollow's situation over in her head many times since she'd arrived. She understood, better than anyone who hadn't seen the inside of that kitchen, exactly how precarious things were. But there was a difference between doing the arithmetic alone at night and hearing someone say it plainly to your face in the middle of the day. "Thank you for the coffee," Lenora said. "Think about it," Clara said. "The position is open through the end of November. After that, I'll need to make other arrangements." Lenora went back out front and collected Maisie from the counter. The girl had finished her biscuit and was now examining a display of ribbon spools, with the focused evaluation of a 7-year-old who had opinions about color. "Ready?" Lenora said. "Can I have the blue one?" Maisie said. "Not today." Maisie accepted this without complaint. She had learned, Lenora had noticed, not to push at things. She either asked once or didn't ask at all, and she took the answer she got without a scene. A child who had been taught or had taught herself that the adults around her were already carrying as much as they could. They walked back toward the ranch supply merchant, and Maisie slipped her hand into Lenora's without comment, the way she sometimes did when they were in town, and Lenora held it without comment, and they walked that way down the street. Lenora turned Clara's offer over in her head for the rest of the day. She turned it over while she finished the preserving she'd been in the middle of when they left for town. She turned it over, through supper and through the cleaning afterward, and through the hour she spent with Maisie on her schoolwork. She was still turning it over when she banked the fire and went to her room. $12 a month, a locked room, regular wages. Against a promise in April from a man whose bank was squeezing him and whose ledger she had not been shown, but whose situation she understood the shape of. She took the $11 out of her boot and sat with it in the lamplight. She had kept this money through everything. Every day she had been at Iron Hollow, this money had been in her boot. She had not spent it, because spending it would mean she believed she was staying, and she had not let herself fully believe she was staying. Because a woman who believed that too hard, without wages, without security, without a signed arrangement of any kind, was a woman building a house on ground she didn't own. Clara Wexley was right, that was the thing. Clara was not wrong about a single word she'd said. And yet, Lenora thought about Maisie's hand in hers on the street. She thought about the ceramic cup on the right shelf of the kitchen cabinet and her tin cup beside it. She thought about Reuben saying that's the best thing I've eaten since March. She thought about Silas at the study door saying the numbers for November are looking different in the voice of a man for whom that was everything he knew how to offer. She thought about the kitchen, how it had changed. How the changing of it had been the first time in a long time that she had been working towards something, rather than just for someone. She put the $11 back in her boot. She would give it more time. She would give it until the end of November, which was what Clara's deadline required anyway. She would keep windows were dark. She would keep doing what she was doing, and she would watch the numbers, and she would figure out whether Iron Hollow was a place that could survive, or whether it was a place that was going to take her down with it. That was the decision she made at the end of 38 days. She did not know yet that in 4 days, Silas Calder would receive a letter from the bank that would change every calculation she had made. She found out on a Wednesday morning in late November, not because Silas told her directly, but because she found him in the kitchen before she came down, which had never happened before. He was always in the barn or the fields before Rose sitting at the table with her open in front of him and his coffee going cold, which also had never happened. She looked at him. She looked at the letter without reading it. "Bad news," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked up. There were lines around his eyes that morning that hadn't been there the night before, or maybe they had. And she hadn't noticed, or maybe they had always been there, and the particular angle of the morning light was just making them visible now. "They moved the deadline," he said. "How far?" "From March to January." She sat down, not at the far end of the table, at the chair closest to the one he was sitting in, which was not something she had done before at this table. The table had unspoken arrangements, like most shared furniture does, and that chair was not where she usually sat. She sat in it anyway. "How much do you need to make the January payment?" she said. He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head. She had a good head for numbers, had always had, which was what had made her useful in kitchens beyond just the cooking. She knew what Iron Hollow's current monthly operating costs were, because she had been watching them for 6 weeks. She knew roughly what the cattle operation was generating, She knew about the flour contract that would start saving money in January if there was a January to get to. If we cut the purchasing costs further through December, she said, and if the December sale numbers hold. It's still short, he said. How short? He told her that too. She sat with the number. It was not an impossible number. It was a very hard number. It was a number that required everything to go right in a period, when things had not been going right for this ranch for 2 years. What are the options? She said. Silas looked at her across the table with an expression she had seen on him before, the look of a man who had been carrying a problem alone long enough that being asked about it directly by another person was disorienting in a way he didn't entirely know how to handle. Sell part of the herd early, he said, at bad prices because nobody sells early unless they have to, and the buyers know it. What does that leave you with? A smaller herd and less capacity to build back next year. But the ranch, he agreed. They sat there for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have just agreed that a bad option is still an option and that an option, however bad, is better than none. I need to think, he said. Yes, she said. She got up and poured his coffee out and poured him a fresh cup and put it in front of him and went to start breakfast. Behind her, she heard him pick up the letter again. She heard the paper move and then she heard nothing, which meant he was reading it again, even though she was sure he had already read it many times. Some people read bad news over and over, hoping it will change. She understood this. She had done it herself with her letter from the Prouty Hotel. The thing about bad news in a letter was that the letter was always the same. The numbers didn't move. The deadline didn't soften. The thing that had happened and was going to stay having happened. What you could change was what you did next. She cracked 4 eggs into the pan and turned the heat up and began to think about what, exactly, could still be done with 60 days and a ranch that was refusing to give up even when it probably should have. She was still thinking when the hands came in for breakfast. She served them without speaking much, which was not unusual. But she was aware, in a way she hadn't been before that morning, of the weight of 8 people's situation pressing on the kitchen. Maisie eating her oatmeal. Reuben wrapping his hands around his coffee. Del saying thank you the way he always did. Jake leaving space for the others first, before he reached for the bread. These were people who had no idea that the ground under their feet had just shifted again. Lenora looked at the pan she was cleaning. She thought about Clara Wexley's offer. She thought about the locked room and the $12 a month and the safety of a position at an establishment that was not fighting a bank deadline. She thought about Maisie's 11 long division problems spread across the kitchen table the night before. She thought about the ceramic cup that hadn't been moved in 18 months, sitting beside her tin one. She thought about the arithmetic that now said there might be no spring wages to collect. She put the clean pan on its hook and went to the pantry and stood in the dark for a moment, looking at the shelves she had reorganized. She had rebuilt this pantry. She had found the forgotten potatoes and the spoiled beans and the unsealed lard, and she had fixed all of it. She had built a flour contract that was going to save this household real money starting in January. She had turned scraps into meals and waste into working parts of a household that now functioned. And there was a real, serious possibility that in January, when that bank came for what it was owed, none of it would be enough. A woman in her position had to be honest with herself about that. She stood in the pantry and she was honest with herself about it. Then she came back out and started the noon preparations, because the noon bell had to ring and the food had to be there when it did, and whatever else was true, the 8 people in this household were going to eat. That was what she could do today. She would do the rest of it tomorrow. The days after the letter arrived had a different quality to them. Not louder, if anything, quieter. The kind of quiet that settles over a house when everyone in it knows something is wrong, but nobody has agreed yet on whether to say it out loud. Silas moved through the ranch with the same deliberate motion as always. But there was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before November, and he started taking the ledger to his study after supper instead of leaving it on the desk where anyone could see it, which told Lenora more than any conversation would have. She let him have the quiet. She had learned, in the 6 weeks she had been at Iron Hollow, that Silas Calder processed hard things the way certain animals processed injury, by going still and inward and waiting to see whether the thing was survivable before he decided what to do about it. Pushing at him during that period accomplished nothing. It just made him tighter, so she did not push. What she did instead was go back to the numbers. She had a habit, going back years, of keeping her own informal accounting of whatever household she was in. Not because anyone asked her to. Nobody ever asked the cook to understand the finances, but because understanding where the money went was the only way to know where it could be saved, and saving was the only real lever she had ever had access to. In Cincinnati, in the boarding house in Indiana, in the hospital laundry in Pittsburgh, she didn't think about in every place she had worked. She had kept her own private tally. At Iron Hollow, she had been keeping it since the second week. She spread her notes on the kitchen table late at night, after the house was asleep, and she worked through them the way you work through a problem that doesn't have a clean answer methodically, without rushing, acknowledging every number for what it was, rather than what you wished it were. The ranch's food and household costs had come down significantly since her arrival. That was real, and it was documented. The flour contract would reduce costs further beginning in January, assuming there was an Iron Hollow in January to deliver flour to. The preserved meat meant less purchasing through winter. The soap she had rendered from fat meant nothing spent on that through at least February. These were not trivial savings on a ranch this size. Accumulated over months, they were the difference between a household that was bleeding slowly and one that was bleeding faster. But Clara Wexley's voice was still in her head, and Clara had not been wrong. The gap between what Iron Hollow needed and what it had was not a gap that clever household management could close. It was a ranching problem, not a kitchen problem, and Lenora knew the difference. She could make the household as efficient as human ingenuity allowed, and it would still not generate the kind of money that moved a bank deadline. She sat at the kitchen table. At 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, her lamp turned low to save oil, and she was honest with herself the way she had always tried to be, even when honesty was uncomfortable. She had been at Iron Hollow for 44 days. She had been paid nothing. She had not been promised nothing. Silas had promised spring wages, and she believed he had meant it when he said it. But a promise made by a man who might not have a ranch in 60 days was a promise built on ground that was currently being sold out from under it. The arithmetic was simple. If Iron Hollow survived January, she would eventually be paid. If it did not, she would leave with the same $11 she had arrived with, no less, because she had spent 43 cents of it on ribbon for Maisie's birthday in 2 weeks, and she had not regretted it, but it was still spent. She folded her notes and put them away, and sat in the dark kitchen for a while. She thought about what it meant to have worked 44 days for a promise. She thought about what it meant to leave. Then she banked the fire and went to bed, and she lay there in the narrow room off the kitchen and listened to the Wyoming wind and did not sleep well. The next morning she was up at 4:30, the same as always, because whatever she was going to decide, and the coffee still needed making, and 6 ranch hands and 1 small girl and their employers still needed to eat. That was the thing about her situation that people on the outside probably didn't understand. She could not afford the luxury of a crisis. A crisis required the ability to stop what you were doing and attend to the crisis, and she did not have that ability. The work continued, regardless of what she was privately working through, and in some ways she was grateful for it because it kept her moving forward on the days when moving forward was hard. Maisie came down at 6:15 with her hair braided only on one side, the other half still loose, holds her school slate and looking like someone had assembled her from parts that didn't quite align. "You forgot the other braid," Lenora said. "I know," Maisie said. "I got tired of it. Sit down." Maisie sat on the kitchen stool, and Lenora braided the other side, while the oatmeal finished on the stove, working quickly because she had done this enough times now that her hands knew the motion without requiring her full attention. Maisie sat very still when Lenora braided her hair. She always did still in a way she never was otherwise, like she understood this required cooperation. "Miss Lenora," Maisie said. "Yes. Are we going to lose the ranch?" Lenora's hands did not stop moving in the braid. She finished the second tie before she said anything. "Who told you about that?" "Nobody told me. I heard Daddy talking to Reuben." Lenora came around in front of her and looked at her. 7 years old with her 2 finished braids and her school slate and her face doing the careful neutral thing it did when she was asking something. She was already afraid of the answer to. "I don't know," Lenora said. "It's being worked on." "But you don't know." "I don't know," she said again, because Maisie had the particular quality of a child who could detect a softened truth from 20 feet away and responded to it worse than to the real thing. What I do know is that Tatyer's trying hard, and there are people here trying with him. That's what I know right now. Maisie looked at her for a moment. Okay, she said, and got down from the stool and went to the table with her slate. It was not enough. Lenora knew it wasn't enough. But it was what was true, and true was what she had to offer. The conversation she had been avoiding with Silas happened on a Friday. Not because she planned it, she had been specifically not planning it, giving him the space she'd decided he needed, but because he came into the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon. While the hands were out, and Maisie was at her lessons and found her re-inventorying the cold room, and he stood in the doorway and said, "Miss Vance," turned. He looked like a man who had been composing something for several days and had finally to say it. "The situation with the bank," he said. "Yes, I want you to know I haven't forgotten what I owe you." She waited. "If things go badly in January," he said, "I intend to settle the wage before." He stopped. He started again. "Before anything else is resolved." She looked at him. A wage settled before a bank foreclosure on a ranch that had already spent 2 years being eaten alive by debt was a wage that existed primarily as intention. She understood he meant it. She also understood what intentions were worth in the arithmetic of a bank deadline. "Silas," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name directly. It came out before she decided to say it, and she saw something shift in his expression, not displeasure, just surprise. Kept going. "The situation I'm in," she said, "is that I came here on nothing, and I've been working for nothing for 47 days. I don't say that to shame you. I say it because I need to be honest with you the way I need you to be honest with me, and I'm not sure either of us has been entirely honest with the other about what this arrangement actually looks like." He was quiet. "You're a good man doing the best you can," she said. "But I am a woman who has exactly—" She thought about whether to say the specific number and decided she had nothing left to lose by precision. $10.59 to her name. "And Clara Wexley has offered me $12 a month, a private room, and wages that don't depend on whether a bank decides to be reasonable in January." The silence that followed was long. "Are you leaving?" he said. "I'm telling you where I stand," she said. "I haven't decided." "What would make a difference?" She almost laughed. Not unkindly, just at the directness of it, which was so purely Silas that it landed somewhere between frustrating and endearing. He had the quality, when he finally engaged with something, of going straight at it without decoration. "Honesty," she said. "Tell me the real number. Tell me what January actually looks like. Not the number you tell yourself at night when you're trying to believe it's manageable. The real one," he told her. She did the arithmetic. It was worse than she'd thought. Not dramatically worse. Not the kind of worse that meant hopeless, but worse in the specific way of a number that required everything to work perfectly and left no room for the ordinary failures that life on a cattle ranch in Wyoming territory involved as a matter of course. "Partial herd sale," she said. "If you move early, in the next 3 weeks, price," he told her. She worked through it. "That plus the operating savings through December, is it enough for the January payment?" He was quiet for a moment. "Calculating, barely. Barely is not the same as no." "No," he said. "It's not. And the ranch would still be running in February. Smaller ranch. A running one." He looked at her. She looked back. There was a conversation happening. Underneath the conversation, as there sometimes was with Silas, the one where he was processing whether to trust something, whether to reach toward something, whether the cost of reaching was too high compared to the cost of not. "I need more time," he said. "You have 60 days, she said. "That's not more time. That's exactly the time you have." Pressed his mouth together. "I know that. Then use it." She picked up her clipboard and went back to the cold room inventory, because the conversation had reached the end of what it could do right now, and continuing it beyond that point would just bruise something that didn't need to be bruised. She heard him stand in the doorway another moment, then his boots on the kitchen floor moving away. She stood in the cold room with her clipboard and her breath making small clouds in the air, and she thought, "I don't know if I'm staying. I genuinely do not know." That night, Maisie asked her to read aloud from the schoolbook. She'd been working through a collection of stories, some of them quite good, and some of them tedious in the way educational stories often were. And Lenora sat at the kitchen table and read while Maisie leaned against her side and listened. which was a position Maisie had gradually worked her way into over the weeks. She had started at the opposite end of the bench and migrated incrementally, the way a cat moves toward warmth so slowly. You don't notice until you realize it's sitting on your lap. Lenora read 2 stories. Maisie fell asleep against her arm before the second one was finished. Lenora sat for a few minutes in the quiet kitchen with the child asleep against her and the lamp burning low, and she felt something so specific and inconvenient that she almost pushed it away. She did not want to leave. That was the thing she had been working very hard not to feel clearly, because feeling it clearly meant it was a factor in her arithmetic, and she had survived this long by keeping her arithmetic clean. Sentiment was a weight you carried that didn't build anything and didn't feed anyone. She had watched women in other households let sentiment keep them in situations that were bad for them, staying in places out of attachment when the attachment was to something that wasn't going to survive anyway. She knew all of that, and she still did not want to leave. She carried Maisie to her bed. The girl was heavier asleep than awake, the way children always were, and she came back to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked out at the dark ranch. Then she went to her room and took out her notes. She was going to give this until the end of November. She had already decided that in the conversation with Clara, end of November, if the situation at Iron Hollow looked like it had a real path through January, she would stay. If it looked like a man trying to hold water in his hands, she would take the hotel job and she would send Maisie something nice for her birthday from a distance, and she would not look back, because looking back was how you got stuck. That was the decision. She wrote it down, which was her way of making things real. Then she went to sleep. The following week was the hardest one she had spent at Iron Hollow. Not because anything dramatic happened in it. In fact, almost nothing happened, which was the problem. The ranch moved through its routines. The hands worked. Meals came and went. Maisie did her schoolwork. The cold got deeper and the days got shorter, and the bank deadline moved 1 week closer without anyone doing anything visible about it. Silas disappeared into the logistics of the partial herd sale, negotiating with buyers she never met, riding out to count stock with Reuben, doing sums at the kitchen table late at night, with the same expression he had worn every other night since the letter arrived. Except that now the expression had the additional quality of someone doing arithmetic that might just barely be working. She left him alone with it, but she watched. She watched the way you watch something you've invested in, not with the panicked energy of someone afraid of losing it, but with the steady attention of someone who is trying to understand what she is actually looking at. What she was looking at was a man who was not giving up. That was the thing she had not fully accounted for. She had expected, when the letter arrived, the weight of it would crush something in Silas, that the second hard hit on top of 2 hard years would be the one that knocked the fight out of him. She had seen it happen to people before, that particular surrender, where someone who has been strong for a long time finally decides the cost of staying strong is too high and lets go. Silas did not let go. He renegotiated the buyer's terms twice. He drove 40 miles himself to speak to the mill contact directly about accelerating the first flour delivery. So the savings started in December rather than January. He went through the operating accounts, line by line, and found 2 places where costs could be cut further, which he brought to her not as a decision he had made, but as a question he was asking, because both cuts affected the kitchen. If we cut the second meat order and extend the preserved stock, he said, spreading his notes on the kitchen table, does it hold through December? She looked at the numbers. She thought about the preservation she had done in October, which she knew precisely because she had inventoried it twice. If the hands don't work heavy outdoor days, more than 3 times a week, she said, hard work needs more protein. If I know the schedule, Reuben can give you the schedule. Then yes, she said. He nodded. He made a note. The lamp oil, he said. We're using, I already cut it, she said.
Last Tuesday.
I moved the evening work closer to the kitchen fire, so we need fewer lamps. He looked up from his notes. She looked back at him. You didn't wait to be asked, he said. No. When did you start doing that? Week 3, she said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one, the kind of expression that recognized something without being fully prepared to name it. I didn't notice, he said. You were busy, Miss Vance, he said. Lenora. He stopped. He tried again. I don't always say I know. I don't always say when something is. Silas, she said, in the same tone she'd used the first time, The tone that said they were past the formality, even if they hadn't explicitly agreed to be. I know, it's all right. He looked at her for a moment. It's not actually, he said, but I'll try to do better. She was not prepared for that. She nodded and turned back to the stove because she was not prepared for it, and she needed a moment, and the stove was a reasonable place to be. Reuben came in from the barn that afternoon and stopped when he felt the particular quality of the kitchen's atmosphere, the way he sometimes did, like a man with a good barometer. Poured coffee and sat down and looked at nothing in particular and said, "He's going to make the January payment." Lenora turned from the stove. "How do you know?" "Because I've seen him when he's quit before," Reuben said, "and that's not what he looks like." "When has Silas quit before?" Reuben was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looking at it. "After Ruth died. About 3 months after. He quit for about a week." Stopped. He looked up. Then Maisie spilled a whole pot of soup on herself, not badly. She wasn't hurt, just soaked, and she stood there in the kitchen, dripping soup and trying not to cry, and Silas walked in and he shook his head. Came back, just like that, because she needed him to. Lenora stood at the stove. "I'm telling you this," Reuben said, "because I've been on this land a long time, and I've watched this family a long time, and I want you to know that what's happening right now, what you've done here, it's not nothing." "Cook," she said. "No," Reuben said simply. "You don't just cook." She didn't answer that. He finished his coffee and went back out. She stood at the stove and listened to the door close behind him. The end of November came. She woke up on November 30th and lay in the narrow bed and thought, "Today is the day I decided I would make a decision." The room of its windows were dark. The room was dark and cold, and the wind was working through the eaves, and Maisie was asleep with her school slate on the floor beside her bed, because she always dropped it there and never put it away properly. Lenora lay there and thought about Clara's offer. She thought about the locked room and the $12 a month. She thought about the arithmetic. Then she thought about Reuben saying, "That's not what he looks like," and Silas saying, "I'll try to do better," and Maisie's hand in hers on the street in Dry Creek. She got up. She built the fire. She made the coffee. She did not write to Clara Wexley. She told herself she was giving it one more week, then another. December arrived with a hard freeze that came earlier than expected and kept everyone busy in a focused, practical way that left little room for deliberation about anything except surviving the immediate cold. The partial herd sale went through in the first week of December. She knew it had happened because Silas came in for supper that night and sat down and ate an entire plate of food without the jaw tension she had been watching for 6 weeks. And after supper, he sat at the kitchen table while Maisie did her homework, and he did not take the ledger to the study. He left it on the table. He didn't say anything about the sale. She didn't ask. But when she cleared the table, she paused for a moment and topped off his coffee without being asked. And he said thank you in a voice that meant something slightly larger than coffee. She said, "You're welcome," and carried the dishes to the sink. 400 cattle had become 280. She knew that from the numbers she'd seen over Reuben's shoulder in the barn earlier that day, not from anything Silas had told her. A significant loss. It meant a harder year ahead, a thinner margin, less capacity to build back quickly. It was not the solution she would have chosen if she'd had the luxury of choosing something better. But it was the January payment, and a ranch still standing in February was a ranch that had another year to fight. 3 days after the sale, she found Maisie sitting at the kitchen table with something large and flat open in front of her that Lenora did not recognize immediately because she had never had reason to look at the ranch's wage ledger. It was a heavy book, the cover worn green leather, the kind of book meant to last decades. It lay open on the table, and Maisie was bent over it with a pencil, working very carefully and slowly in the way of someone who understands that what they are doing is important and permanent. Lenora came to the table. She looked over Maisie's shoulder. The ledger was open to the hired hands page, the page where Silas recorded names, weeks worked, and wages owed. All 6 ranch hands were entered in Silas's neat, practiced handwriting. Names is in the left column, each week's entry in the date column, the wage figure at the right. Below the last hand's name, in the careful, slightly uneven pencil handwriting of a 7-year-old who took her letters seriously, Maisie had written Lenora, and she was filling in the weeks, 1 through 11. Each week's box carefully marked, Lenora's name in the ledger beside the 6 hired men, every week accounted for. The wage column was blank beside every entry. because Maisie didn't know what number belonged there. She had written the weeks and left the wages for someone else to fill in. Lenora stood behind Maisie and looked at those 11 careful pencil entries and could not speak for a moment. You shouldn't have, she started. You work here, Maisie said without looking up. She finished the 11th entry and set the pencil down carefully and looked at what she had written. Everyone who works here is in the book. That's how it works. Daddy showed me. Maisie, the wage part is empty because I don't know the number. She looked up at Lenora now, direct and clear in the way she always was when she had thought something through completely. But you worked those weeks, so they should be in the book. Lenora looked at the 11 lines, 11 weeks, 63 words in a child's careful handwriting that said, "You were here," and it counted and someone noticed. She put her hand on Maisie's shoulder for a moment. Then she moved her hand and went to the stove and stayed there with her back turned for a while. "Whose ledger is this?" she said when her voice was stable. "The ranch ledger. It lives on Daddy's desk, but I knew where it was. Does your father know you have it?" "Not yet," Maisie said, in the tone of someone who has made peace with the consequences of a decision and is not looking to be talked out of it. "You need to show him." "I know. Tonight. I know," Maisie said again, and closed the ledger with both hands, the way you close something important. Lenora stood at the stove. She was thinking about many things at once, in the way she had when something happened that rearranged the picture. She was thinking about the 11 blank wage columns. She was thinking about Clara Wexley's offer, which had a deadline she had already technically passed, and whether Clara would extend it or whether that door had closed. She was thinking about the January payment, now apparently real enough that Silas had managed to eat supper without his jaw set like a man waiting for a blow. She was thinking about what it meant that a 7-year-old had looked at the wage ledger of a working ranch and understood without being told that the woman cooking in the kitchen had the same right to be in it as any hired man. She was thinking about how long it sometimes took the adults in a room to understand what a child had already figured out. She was thinking about her $11.59 and the narrow room off the kitchen and the ceramic cup and the braids she did every morning and the long division and the way the kitchen had felt in that first week, cold and neglected and full of forgotten things in the dark. She was thinking about whether any of this had changed the fundamental arithmetic of her situation. And then she thought about something she had not let herself think about clearly until just now, in 60 days. If everything held, Iron Hollow would still be standing, and she would have been here through all of it. She would have been here when it mattered, and she would still not have been paid, and she would have a choice that she had been postponing since the conversation with Clara, maybe longer, maybe since the night she arrived. She would have to decide whether she was a woman who stayed in a place where she had not been paid because something in her had decided it was worth staying in, or whether she was going to be honest about the fact that she needed her wages and she needed security, and wanting those things did not make her small. She had not decided. She stood at the stove and she had not decided. Kitchens was hung by the back door, a cast iron bell on a hook that had been there since the ranch was built. She rang it every day. Before the noon meal, she had started that in the first week, because the hands were spread across the property and needed the signal, and the bell was the practical solution. She rang it that day without thinking about it, the way she did every day, and she heard the answering sounds from across the ranch, the barn door, the distant field, the bunkhouse, as the men began moving toward the kitchen. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know yet that in less than 3 days she would make a decision that would silence that bell and send 6 men across every street in Dry Creek looking for her. She only knew what she knew at that moment, which was that the food was ready and the people were coming. And she had 11 pencil lines in a ledger and $10.59, and she still did not know what she was going to do. She turned from the stove. She picked up the ladle. She waited for them to come in from the cold. That evening, Maisie showed Silas the ledger. Lenora was at the sink when it happened, finishing the last of the supper dishes. She heard Maisie's footsteps cross the floor from the kitchen to the study, the particular sound of a child who has made up her mind and is moving before she can unmake it, and then the sound of the study door opening and Maisie's voice saying, "Daddy, I need to show you something." Lenora did not go to the door. She stayed at the sink. She heard the silence that followed. The particular quality of a silence means that someone is looking at something and processing what they are seeing. It went on longer than she expected. Then Silas's voice, very quiet. Where did you get this? Your desk, Maisie said. I knew where it was. You showed me last year. Another silence, Maisie. His voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger. Something closer to a man who has been shown something about himself that he had not been prepared to see. These entries. She works here, Maisie said. The same as Reuben and Jake and Dell and all of them. She works here every day, and she's not in the book. That's not right. Lenora set the last dish on the rack and dried her hands and stood very still at the sink. No, Silas said, after a moment that lasted long enough to have a wait. It's not. The wage part is empty, Maisie said. I didn't know the number. I know. You know the number. Yes, he said. I know the number. Lenora heard the sound of a chair, the shift of someone standing. Then Silas's voice again. Quieter still. Go to bed, Maisie. Are you going to fill in the wages? Go to bed. Maisie's footsteps came back across the floor. She appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at Lenora with the expression of a child who has done what she set out to do and is not entirely sure of the aftermath. Good night, Lenora said. Good night, Maisie said. She hesitated. I put you in the book. I know you did, Lenora said. Thank you. Maisie went upstairs. The house was quiet in the way it got late at night when the fire was low and the hands were in the bunkhouse and it was just the building settling around its own weight. Lenora finished putting away the dishes and wiped down the counter and did the last few small things that needed doing before a kitchen could be properly left for the night. The study door did not open. She banked the fire and went to her room. She lay on the bed without undressing, the way she had on her first night, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about the ledger and the 11 pencil lines and the blank wage column. And she thought, something has shifted. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming before it arrives, not seeing it yet, just sensing the change in pressure. She did not know what it meant. She knew it meant something. She took the $10.59 out of her boot and held it for a long time. Then she put it back. The next 2 days were strange ones. Silas was at the kitchen table at breakfast both mornings, which he sometimes was and sometimes wasn't, but there was a quality to his presence those 2 mornings that was different, a deliberateness, like a man who had decided to pay attention to something he had been not quite seeing. He asked Maisie questions about her schoolwork that were more specific than usual. He said thank you when Lenora set his coffee down, which he usually did but sometimes forgot. He did not say anything about the ledger. She did not ask. On Malstavit's Windsainsapin, the second evening, he came into the kitchen while she was preparing supper and stood at the counter for a moment doing nothing in particular, which was not something Silas did. He was not a man who stood around. He was in a room for a reason, or he wasn't in it. The flour contract, he said. The first delivery confirmed for January 3rd. Good, she said. The savings from December's cuts. Reuben ran the number this afternoon. He paused. You were right. It was enough. She turned from the stove. Enough for January? Enough to make the payment and keep the household running through February. He said it the way he said things that cost him something emotionally flat and direct, like a man reading figures from a page, because that was the only register in which he could say them without their weight becoming visible. It's tight. There's no room for anything to go wrong. But it's enough. It's enough. She turned back to the stove. Lenora, he said. She had not stopped being slightly surprised when he used her given name. He had been doing it more since the conversation in the cold room, but it still had a particular texture each time, like something still finding its shape. I owe you an honest conversation, he said. She set down the spoon. She turned around. He was looking at her with the expression he got when he had been composing something for a while. She had learned to recognize it, the slight tension around his eyes, the way he held himself a fraction more carefully than usual, like a man who has prepared for a difficult thing and is now doing it. When you came here, he said, I made you a promise about spring wages. And I said it like it was a reasonable thing to say, because at the time I needed to believe it was. He stopped. The truth is, I said it because I needed what you could do, and I couldn't pay you to do it. And I told myself the arrangement was fair when the arithmetic was never fair. She said nothing. You've worked here 11 weeks, he said, and I know what 11 weeks of what you've done is worth, and I haven't given you $1 of it, and I've been telling myself it was circumstance. He pressed his mouth together. It wasn't only circumstance. Silas, let me finish. He said it quietly but firmly, and she let him. The ledger, he said. What Maisie did. A 7-year-old child looked at my books and understood something I had let myself not understand, which is that what you do here is work. The same as any man on this ranch. It earns wages. And the fact that I haven't paid them isn't something I can keep excusing with the bank or the winter or anything else. Kitchen was very quiet. I haven't decided what I'm doing, she said carefully. I want you to know that. I haven't made a decision. I know, he said. Clara Wexley made you an offer. She looked at him. It's a small county, he said. Yes, she said, she did. It's a good offer, it is. He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he had already decided to accept. Then here is what I want to say. Whatever you decide, Lenora, I intend to pay what's owed to you. The full 11 weeks, before you make any decision. Not as a way of asking you to stay. As the thing that should have happened already, and didn't. She looked at him for a long time. The bank payment is in 31 days, she said. Yes, you were saving cash for it, yes. If you pay me the 11 weeks, I know what it does to the cash reserve, he said. I've done the arithmetic. Silas. If you pay me, and then the payment comes short, then it comes short, he said, and the bank takes what it takes. But it won't take a ranch that owes a debt to the woman who helped keep it alive. She did not say anything for a moment. There was something happening in her chest that she did not entirely have a name for. Not sentiment, or not only sentiment, something more structural than that. The feeling of something that had been wrong for a long time being acknowledged as wrong by the person responsible for it. She had not known how much she needed that until it happened. Let me think, she said. Take the time you need, he said. And then, with the particular difficulty of a man who does not perform emotion, but is occasionally overcome by it, she was right. Maisie, you belonged in that book from the first week. I should have put you there myself. He went back to the study. She stood at the stove and did not immediately do anything. Then she served supper, because supper needed serving, and she sat at the edge of the kitchen while the hands ate, which she sometimes did when the table was full, and she looked at the 6 men at that table and thought about what Reuben had told her. I want you to know that what you've done here is not nothing. And she thought about 11 weeks and $10 and 59 cents and a hotel room with a lock on the door. She thought about Maisie's 11 pencil lines. She thought for a long time that night, in the narrow room off the kitchen. And in the morning, she had made her decision. She got up at 4:30. She built the fire. She made the coffee. She moved through the kitchen in the dark, with the particular efficiency of someone who knows every surface and angle by feel now, which she knew, this kitchen. The way she had come to know every kitchen she'd worked in for long enough, but differently, because this one she had rebuilt from the inside out. She banked the fire correctly. She left the coffee on the stove. She wrote the instructions for the day's meals on the slate board she had set up on the wall, because she had been doing that for 2 weeks so Reuben could manage lunch if she was in town, so it would not unusual that it was there. Then she went to her room and she packed her trunk. She was not angry. She was not bitter. She was not making a statement. She was a woman with $10.59 who had worked 11 weeks without wages, and the arithmetic had been the same arithmetic all along. And she had looked at it clearly and honestly. And she had understood that wanting something to work out was not the same as it working out, and that a woman in her position could not afford to want things more than she could afford to need them. Iron Hollow might survive January. She believed it might. She believed Silas would fight for it until the last possible moment, and that the numbers he'd run with Reuben might just hold. She believed Maisie would grow up on this land and ring the kitchen bell when she was old enough to reach it without a stool. But she could not stake her last $10.59 on that belief. Silas had said he would pay her. She believed he meant it. She also knew that a man who was managing a bank payment with no room for error and a cash reserve already stretched to its limit could mean something completely and still have circumstances take it away from him. She had been a woman without resources before. She knew what that felt like. She was not willing to be that woman again, because she had stayed somewhere for reasons that were not arithmetic. She wrote a note. She left it on the kitchen table where it would be found. She did not say where she was going. Clara Wexley's hotel was the only logical destination, and Silas was not a man who would fail to work that out. But she did not say it explicitly in the note. She wrote that she was grateful for the 11 weeks and that the pantry accounts were current and the flour delivery would arrive January 3rd, and the preserves were inventoried on the slate board inside the cold room door. Shupstovit's windows were dark. She did not write anything about Maisie because there was nothing she could write about Maisie that would be the right size for a note. She left the note on the table beside the coffee pot, weighted down with a tin cup. Not her tin cup. She had moved her tin cup. She had taken it back to her room and packed it in her trunk because it was hers, because it had always been hers, and because, she was leaving, but she was not leaving everything. The house was still dark when she carried her trunk through the kitchen door. Cold hit her immediately, the particular clean cold of early morning in Wyoming territory in December, and her breath made clouds in the air, and the frost on the grass crackled under her feet. She carried her trunk to the road. It was harder going than the first time, when the ground had been frozen but not yet deeply frozen. Now the ruts were set like iron, and the weight of the trunk caught on them differently, and she had to stop twice to reset her grip. But she moved steadily, the way she always moved when she had made a decision, without second-guessing, without looking back, because looking back was how you convinced yourself to undo the only sensible thing you'd managed to do. She reached the road as the sky was just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. She set the trunk down. She stood there. She did not think about the kitchen. She did not think about Maisie's braids or the long division or the ceramic cup that would now be sitting on the shelf alone again. She did not think about Reuben's coffee cup or Dell's nightly thank you or Jake's firewood inside the kitchen door. She stood at the road and thought forward. Clara's hotel is 6 miles. Cold is manageable. I have done harder things than walk 6 miles. She picked up her trunk. She walked. By the time the ranch was a dark outline behind her, the sky had opened into the gray-pink of early morning, and she could see the wagon road ahead of her clearly, and she moved along it with her head down and her arms working and her breath coming in steady clouds. She did not stop. The morning she arrived at Clara Wexley's hotel, Clara came to the back door herself when Lenora knocked, which suggested someone had told her to expect this day eventually, even if they hadn't known the exact morning. Clara looked at her. She looked at the trunk. She looked at the state of Lenora's coat and hair, which were the state of someone who had walked 6 miles in December. "Come in," Clara said. She brought her into the kitchen, a good kitchen, well organized, warm from the breakfast preparations already underway, and she poured her coffee, and she did not immediately ask anything, which was one of the things Lenora would come to appreciate about Clara Wexley. She just let her sit. After the coffee was half done, Clara said, "The position is still open." "I know," Lenora said. "That's why I'm here. $12 a month." "Yes." "Rooms upstairs, second door on the left, lock on the inside." Clara looked at her steadily. "You start this morning if you want." "Yes," Lenora said. "Please." Clara put her to work within the hour. There was a lunch service to prepare for, and a stock order to review, and a new girl young, about 16, clearly from somewhere that had not taught her much about kitchen management, who needed supervision. Lenora fell into it, the way she always fell into kitchens, by learning the layout first and then the patterns, moving efficiently and without wasted motion. By noon, she had the lunch service under control, and she had shown the young girl 3 things she needed to know and had not made her feel stupid about not knowing them, which Lenora believed was the only useful way to teach. She peeled potatoes in the afternoon, a large order for the evening service. She stood at the back of the hotel kitchen with a paring knife and a basin, and she peeled steadily, and she did not think about Iron Hollow. She thought about the wages she would earn starting this month. $12, more than she had been promised at the Prouty. She thought about the locked room upstairs. She thought about February, which was the first month in a long time that she could see clearly as a month in which she would have money. She thought about these things deliberately, because deliberate thinking was the tool she used when the other kind of thinking, the kind that pulled at you from somewhere below the arithmetic, was not useful. She peeled. She was most of the way through the basin when she heard voices from the front of the hotel. Nothing particular at first, just the sound of the door opening and the quality of the sound changing the way it does when the outside comes in. Then a voice she recognized, speaking to Clara, and Clara's voice responding with something short and flat, and then footsteps coming through the hallway toward the kitchen. She did not turn around. She kept peeling. The footsteps stopped at the kitchen door. Lenora. She knew the voice. She had been hearing it for 11 weeks. She recognized it the way you recognize something that has become part of the ambient sound of your daily life, without you noticing it happened. She put the potato down. She put the knife down beside it. She turned around. Silas Calder stood in the doorway of Clara Wexley's kitchen with the green leather ledger under his arm and his coat still carrying the cold from outside and his expression doing the thing it did when he was holding something difficult very carefully so it didn't break. He was not alone. Reuben was behind him in the hallway, and behind Reuben she could see two more of the hands, Dell and Jake, and behind them what looked like the shapes of the other two, which meant he had sent all 6 of them across Dry Creek, looking for her before someone had thought to check the hotel kitchen. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I told you I was going to pay what I owed," he said. Let me finish." It was the second time he'd said that to her. The first time had been in the Iron Hollow kitchen 2 nights ago, and she had let him then, and she let him now. Came into the kitchen. He put the ledger on the counter beside the potato basin. He opened it to the page she already knew the page, with the 6 hands in Silas's handwriting and the 7 in Maisie's pencil below them. The wage column, beside her 11 entries, was no longer blank. He had filled it in. All 11 weeks, the correct wage for what she had done, written in ink in the column. Maisie had left empty because she hadn't known the number. She looked at the numbers. She did the math automatically, the way she always did math. $99. She looked up at him. "That's from the bank payment cash," she said. "Yes, Silas. If you've taken that from the January reserve, I know what I've taken it from. You could lose the ranch. I know that too." He said it without flinching, which was the thing about Silas Calder that she had been learning for 11 weeks. He did not flinch from hard things once he had decided to face them. He faced them the same way he walked into a cold barn at 5 in the morning or looked at a ledger full of bad numbers, directly, without theater, without self-pity. "That's not a reasonable trade," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not reasonable. Reasonable would have been putting you in that ledger in the first week and paying you what you earned instead of making a promise I wasn't sure I could keep." He paused. "I didn't do the reasonable thing then. I'm doing it now." She looked at the ledger. She looked at the $99 that were not in his coat pocket yet, but that she understood were coming. She thought about the bank deadline. She thought about 280 cattle and a flour contract that started January 3rd, and a household she had rebuilt from a neglected kitchen with soft potatoes on the floor. "This could cost you everything," she said. "Lenora." He said her name in the way he had been saying it lately, like it was something real in his mouth, not a formality. A man who can't pay the people who kept his house alive doesn't deserve to keep the house. She looked at him for a long time. Behind him, in the doorway, she could see Reuben watching with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who is witnessing something he already understood was going to happen. Dell was behind him, and Jake, and the other 2, and they were all simply there, the 6 of them, standing in Clara Wexley's hotel hallway because their boss had decided to cross Dry Creek in December to pay a debt before he asked a question. She understood what that meant. She understood all of it, standing there with a paring knife on the counter and a half-peeled basin of potatoes and her trunk upstairs in the locked room she had wanted for 11 weeks. Silas reached into his coat pocket. He counted $99 onto the counter beside the ledger. Not quickly, deliberately, the way you do something you want the other person to witness clearly, bill by bill, while she watched. Then he stepped back. He did not ask her to come back. Not yet. He had said it himself the night before in the Iron Hollow kitchen, not as a way of asking you to stay, as the thing that should have happened already and didn't. He was doing it in the right order. She picked up the money. She counted it herself, because she had always counted her own wages, and she was not going to stop now regardless of the circumstances, or who was watching. $99. Every week, the right number. She held the money in her hands. She thought about $10.59 in a boot. She thought about how that had felt every day, for 11 weeks, reaching for the small stack of folded bills just to confirm it was still there, the way you touch a bruise to see if it still hurts. She thought about what it meant to be a woman whose only real thing was the money in her boot. Because everything else, the position, the promise, the arrangement was built on what other people decided to do. $99 was not a fortune, but it was hers now, in a way that the promise had never quite been hers. She looked up at Silas. He was watching her count. His expression was the expression of a man who has done the thing he decided to do and is now waiting for the consequence of it, whatever that consequence is, without trying to influence it. She thought, he paid me before asking. He did it in the right order. Then she thought, the right order matters. It's the only order that means anything. The January payment, she said. How short does this put you? Something shifted in his face, not hope exactly, but the controlled, careful version of it, the version that a man allows himself when he's been burned enough times to know that hope and outcome are not the same thing. It's manageable, he said. Tight. But I looked at the numbers this morning, with the flour contract and the December cuts. He paused. And the operating savings from the past 11 weeks. She looked at him. The savings are real, he said. You built them into the household. They don't go away just because. He stopped. They don't go away. She turned the money over in her hands once more. $99. Then she looked past him at Reuben in the doorway, who was watching with the expression of a man who has said what he had to say and is now leaving the rest to the people who needed to say it. She looked at the ledger, still open on the counter, with Maisie's 11 careful pencil entries and Silas's ink wages beside them. She thought about a 7-year-old girl who had walked into her father's study holding the ranch ledger because she had understood something that all the adults around her had been too tangled in their own complications to say. Plainly, everyone who works here belongs in the book. She thought about the kitchen bell. She thought about the ceramic cup and the tin cup and the stool that was low enough for Maisie to climb onto. She thought about January and February and what came after that, and what it would mean to be the woman who chose to come back, not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else, but because she had $99 in her hand and a locked room upstairs and the actual freedom to choose. Clara's going to need someone else, she said. Something in Silas's chest moved. She could see it, the slight shift in how he was breathing. He didn't say anything. She had a position to fill, Lenora said. I took it this morning. If I leave, she'll need to arrange someone. I know, he said. That's not a small thing to do to a person. No, he said. It's not. She folded the $99 and held them in her hand and looked at him one more time at the coat cold from December, at the ledger he had carried across Dry Creek, the 6 men standing in a hotel hallway because he had sent them to find her, at the expression on his face that was not asking and was also entirely asking in every other way than the words. Go talk to Clara, she said. Tell her the truth. And then she stopped. She said it. Come back and help me carry the trunk down. His face did the thing it almost never did. He almost smiled. Yes, he said. He went to find Clara. Lenora picked up the paring knife and finished the potatoes she'd been peeling, because Clara's kitchen still needed its evening service prepped and she was still here until she wasn't, and she had never once left a kitchen in worse shape than she found it. Behind her, she heard Reuben say something quiet to Dell. She heard Dell say yeah. She heard Jake's boots on the hallway floor, shifting. And she kept peeling, with $99 in her coat pocket and her trunk upstairs, and the road back to Iron Hollow 6 miles long in the December cold, and she thought, I am a woman who got paid what she earned, and I am choosing where I go next. That was new. That was entirely specifically, concretely new, and it felt like exactly what it was. Clara Wexley was not a woman who fell apart when plans changed. That was the thing about Clara. She had built the only hotel in Dry Creek from a burned-out lot and a small inheritance, and 20 years of understanding that the world was not going to arrange itself to her convenience, and that quality did not leave her when Silas Calder walked into her front room and told her the truth. She listened. She looked at him with the steady, evaluating eyes of a woman who had sized up many situations and many men, and had learned to read the difference between someone coming to her with an excuse and someone coming to her with an accounting. Silas was not making excuses. He said plainly that he had come to pay Lenora what she was owed, and that Lenora had agreed to return to Iron Hollow, and that he understood this created a difficulty for Clara, and that he was sorry for it and intended to say so to directly, rather than let Lenora carry the awkwardness of it alone. Clara was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, She finished my evening service before you came in here. I noticed, he said. She showed my girl 3 things this morning that I've been trying to teach that girl for a month. Clara looked at him. She's been here 6 hours, and she already improved my kitchen. That's what she does, Silas said. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. She looked past him toward the hallway, where she knew the 6 ranch hands were standing, because nothing in a hotel got past the woman who ran it. You brought all of them. I sent them first, he said. I didn't know where she'd gone, and none of them thought to check the hotel first. Dell thought of it, Silas said. He told me when we were already on the 3rd Street. Men, Clara said without particular heat, more like observation. She was quiet again. Silas waited, because this was Clara's decision to make, and he knew it, and he was not going to push at it. I'll need 2 weeks to find someone, she said finally. Jessie can manage the basics, 2 weeks. That's fair, he said. Tell her 2 weeks. She picked up the order sheet she'd been holding when he came in. Silas. She looked at him over it. Pay her on time from here forward, every month. Don't make a promise you can't keep and call it an arrangement. No, he said, I won't. He went back to the kitchen. Lenora had finished the potatoes. She was washing the basin at the sink when he came in. Most of its windows were dark, and she turned when she heard his boots and looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was waiting for information, not anxious, just attentive, the way she looked when she was about to do arithmetic. 2 weeks, he said. She needs 2 weeks. Lenora nodded. She dried her hands. That's fair. I told her it was. She looked around the kitchen at the prepped vegetables, the organized counter, the young girl in the corner who was watching all of this with wide eyes and no idea what to do with herself. Lenora turned to the girl. The potatoes need to go in the cold room until this evening. The onions are already done. Make sure the stock pot stays on low. Not high makes it cloudy. Yes, ma'am, the girl said. You're doing well, Lenora said. You just need to slow down when you cut. Speed comes later. Right now what matters is that everything's the same size, so it cooks even. The girl nodded, looking at her like someone being handed something she hadn't expected to receive. Lenora picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. There was a whole conversation happening in that look that neither of them was going to have in Clara Wexley's kitchen in front of 6 ranch hands in a hallway. Trunk, she said. Right, he said, and he went upstairs to get it. The walk back to Iron Hollow was cold, and the road was hard, and the trunk was heavy, but nobody complained about any of it, because nobody had the relationship with complaint that would have made complaining feel natural. Jake and Dell carried the trunk between them. Reuben walked ahead with Lenora, which had the quality of something he'd chosen deliberately, and he didn't say much for the first mile. Then he said, Maisie's going to come out the door running. She doesn't know yet, Lenora said. She'll know when she sees the wagon coming up the track, he said. That girl has had her eye on the road since this morning. Lenora thought about Maisie, who had woken up this morning to a cold kitchen and a note and a tin cup on the table that was not the right tin cup, because Lenora had taken her own, and what was left was one of the ranch cups, and she had put it on the note because it was the right weight to keep the paper from moving, not for any other reason. But Maisie was 7 and smart, and she would have understood the difference the moment she picked it up. She thought about that and felt something tight in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely while she was still on the road. She put me in the book, Lenora said. She did, Reuben agreed. She knew the principle before either of us named it. Children usually do, Reuben said. They haven't learned yet to look away from the obvious thing. The obvious thing. Lenora turned that over in her head as the road unrolled in front of them, and the cold worked through her coat collar, and the men behind her moved with the quiet efficiency of people doing a task without needing to discuss it. The obvious thing had been there from the first week. She had cooked. She had earned wages. She had not been paid. These were not complicated facts. What had made them complicated was everything laid on top of them: the debt, the deadline, the gratitude that didn't have money to back it up. The promise that was real in intention and uncertain in practice. All of that had been laid over the obvious thing until the obvious thing was buried. It had taken a 7-year-old and a pencil to dig it back out. She thought about that for the rest of the walk. Reuben was right about Maisie. They were still 200 yards from the house when the front door opened and Maisie came down the porch steps in her coat that was too big and her boots not fully laced. And she stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the group coming up the track and found Lenora in it, and her face did the thing that children's faces do when they are so relieved they don't know what expression to make. She did not run. She was too old for running to people in relief, or she believed she was, which was the same thing at 7. She stood at the edge of the yard and waited until they were close enough, and then she said, "You came back. came back, Lenora said. I saw the note, Maisie said. I saw the cup. I know. That was the wrong cup, Maisie said. That was just a ranch cup. I know, Lenora said. I have mine. It's in the trunk. Maisie looked at the trunk that Dell and Jake were carrying. She looked at Lenora. Something settled in her face, not dramatically, not with performance, just the visible relaxation of a child whose anxiety has been resolved and who is now ready to go back to the business of being 7 years old. Your braids are loose, Lenora said. Maisie reached up and felt them. I did them myself this morning. Come inside. I'll redo them before supper. They went in. The kitchen was cold in the specific way it had been cold, that very first morning the fire gone low, the chill moving in from the floor up. Lenora stood in the doorway and looked at it and thought, 3 months ago I walked into this room for the first time, and this is what it felt like. Then she rolled up her sleeves and built the fire back up the right way, and inside 20 minutes the kitchen was warm again, and the coffee was on, and the trunk was against the wall in her room off the kitchen where it had been before, and Maisie was sitting on the stool getting her braids redone, and the hands were coming in from wherever they dispersed to after the walk. And Iron Hollow was making the particular sounds a house makes when it has people in it who belong there. The next 2 weeks had a quality that was different from everything before them. Partly it was December deepening, the cold becoming serious and permanent rather than preliminary. Partly it was the herd sale settling into the new shape of the ranch, 280 cattle instead of 400, which meant different rhythms and different pressures on the men, and different things needed from the kitchen. But mostly it was the feeling that had come into the household since the morning Lenora had left and come back, which was the feeling of things having been said that needed saying, and the air being clearer for it. Silas had changed in a way she noticed but couldn't have described precisely to someone who asked. He was not warmer. Exactly warmth was not his natural register, and she had stopped expecting it to be. But he was more present. He came to the kitchen table at meals more consistently. He asked questions instead of just issuing them. He looked at her when she spoke, rather than looking slightly past her, which had been his habit early, the look of a man who was receiving information while managing to maintain the polite fiction, that he was not entirely depending on the person giving it. He had stopped maintaining that fiction. She noticed when it happened 3 days after she came back, at the supper table, when she said something about the January flower delivery timing, and he looked at her directly and said, "What do you think we should do if it's delayed?" Not a rhetorical question, an actual one. She told him what she thought. He considered it. He said, "That's what I was thinking too." And then he went back to his meal. It was a small thing. Everything at Iron Hollow was small things. But small things were what a household was built of, and she had spent enough time in enough households to know that the texture of them mattered more than anyone from the outside would understand. On the second Saturday, after she returned, Silas knocked on the kitchen door at the end of the evening and handed her an envelope. She opened it. $12. The month's wage, the first one, paid at the end of the first month. She had worked with an arrangement that was what it said it was instead of what someone hoped it would be. She looked at the money and then looked at him. First of every month, he said. If I miss it by more than a day, remind me I will, she said. He went back down the hall. She put the $12 with the 99 and sat in her room for a moment in the quiet and held the whole sum in her hands, $111. More money than she had held at one time in several years, and she thought about what it meant to have it and to have earned it, and to be sitting in a room with a door that was hers, not the locked room in Clara's hotel. This room, which did not have a lock, which was smaller and colder, and had a window that let in a draft if the wind came from the north. But hers in the way that mattered, which was the way of having been given and having chosen, both which was different from either one alone. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried as a response to relief. She put the money away and went to bed. January came on a Tuesday with a windstorm that knocked one of the fence sections loose in the east pastures and kept 3 of the hands busy for the better part of 2 days, repairing it in temperatures that Reuben described with his characteristic flatness, as suggesting the North has a poor opinion of us. The flour delivery from the eastern mill arrived on the 3rd, 1 day late, which Lenora had prepared for by extending the existing stock carefully through the last days of December. The delivery driver was a laconic man named Garris, who drove the same route every quarter, and had the permanent expression of someone who had been cold for so long he had stopped expecting anything else. He unloaded the flour into the dry storage room while Lenora checked the count against the invoice, and when she signed for it, he looked at the organized storage room behind her and said, "Last time I delivered here, the flour went in the kitchen and someone stacked feed bags on top of it." "Not anymore," she said. "No," he agreed and drove away. The bank payment came due on January 15th. Silas drove to town alone that morning. He took the cash and the ledger, and he was gone most of the day, and Lenora ran the ranch's noon meal herself and answered the 4 questions the hands had for her while they ate, and did not let herself think too specifically about what was happening in town. Reuben ate his lunch and drank his coffee, and before he went back out, said, "It'll hold." She looked at him. "I told you before," he said. "I know what it looks like when he's done fighting. That's not what this is." She nodded once. He went back out. She did the dishes. Silas came back at 4 in the afternoon. She heard the wagon on the track, and heard it stop at the barn, and heard the barn door, and then his boots on the frozen ground, moving toward the house. He came through the back door and stood in the kitchen, and she turned from the stove and looked at him. He looked tired. The deep kind of tired that was not about sleep. Kind that came from a day of difficult arithmetic with real consequences delivered directly to your face by people who held the notes on your land. "Well," she said. "Made it," he said. She let out a breath she had not entirely known she was holding. "They weren't pleased," he said. "The partial sale changed the numbers they were looking at. They want a revised accounting for spring." "You'll have one," she said. "Yes." He sat down at the kitchen table. The operating costs helped. When I showed them November against October, it gave them something to look at besides the herd. "The savings are documented. Everything you put on the slate boards, I've been transferring to the accounts ledger every week." He looked at her. "I didn't tell you that." "No," she said. "I should have." "You're telling me now." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a meeting in April, full accounting. If the spring numbers hold." He stopped. "They have to hold." "They'll hold," she said, with more certainty than the arithmetic strictly warranted. But she said it because she believed it was more likely true than not, and because a man who has just made a brutal bank payment in January did not need someone to go through the probability distribution with him right now. He looked at her across the table. "Why did you come back?" he said. It was not the question she had expected. She had expected something about the payment, about what came next. About the spring plan. "Not this, I told you," she said. 2 weeks was fair to Clara. "That's not what I'm asking." She turned from the stove and looked at him properly. He was looking at her with the directness he had when he had decided to ask a real thing instead of a useful one. She had seen it before. She knew what it meant. "Because you paid me first," she said. "And then you asked." "That's the reason? It's part of it." "What's the other part?" She thought about how to say the other part. She was not a woman who had a practiced language. For the other part, she had spent most of her adult life in other people's households, keeping her own interior life private because it was the only thing. That was entirely hers, and privacy was protection. Saying the other part out loud in someone else's kitchen was not a habit she had. But this was not entirely someone else's kitchen anymore. Somewhere in 11 weeks of 4:30 mornings and long division and ceramic cups and cold rooms and ledger entries in a child's pencil handwriting, that had changed. "Because I didn't want to leave," she said. "I left because the arithmetic required it. And I came back because when the arithmetic was settled, leaving still wasn't what I wanted." Silas was quiet. "I've been in a lot of households," she said. "I know the difference between a place you're working and a place you're in. This got to be both." He looked at her for a long time. "I don't know how to say most of what I'd like to say," he said, finally. "I'm aware of that." "I know," she said. "I'm going to try to get better at it." "I know that too." He stayed at the table after that while she finished the supper preparation, and for a while they didn't talk, just occupied the kitchen together in the quiet, companionable way they had been slowly developing without either of them naming it. And the fire was right, and the food was coming together, and outside the January cold was doing what it did. But inside the kitchen, it was warm. It was the beginning of February before Silas said anything more direct than what he'd said in January, and when he said it, he did it in the most Silas way possible, which was to appear in the kitchen doorway on a Thursday evening after supper was cleared and say, "Can I talk to you?" Maisie was at the table. She looked up from her school slate, and then at Lenora, and then at her father, with the sharp attention of a child who understood that something was happening that was meant for adults. I have more long division, Maisie said, to no one in particular. Take it upstairs, Lenora said. Maisie took her slate upstairs with the maximum amount of deliberate slowness that she judged would not be called out. When her footsteps had reached the top of the stairs and her door had closed, Silas came into the kitchen and sat at the table. Lenora sat across from him. He had been thinking about what to say. She could tell from the way he was sitting. He had that quality he got when he had prepared something and was now in the moment of delivering it, and was aware that prepared things sounded different when they came out than they had when they were still inside. I want to say this correctly, he said. Then take your time, she said. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. You came here with $11 and nowhere to go, he said. And in 3 months, you rebuilt this household from something that was failing into something that works. Not just the kitchen, the way the place runs, the way the men are with each other, the way Maisie is. He stopped. The way I am. She did not say anything. I know this is not the arrangement you came here for, he said. I know Dry Creek was not where you were headed, and Iron Hollow was not what you were looking for. I know you've built something here that belongs to you as much as it belongs to anything else because you built it. And I know you have wages now and a choice about where you go, which is what you should have had from the beginning. Silas. Let me finish, he said, for the third time, and she let him. I'm not asking because I need a cook or a housekeeper, he said. I'm not asking because it's practical or because Maisie needs someone or because it makes sense for the ranch, even though all of those things are true. I'm asking because I have been paying attention for 3 months, and what I've been paying attention to is a woman who works harder than anyone I've ever seen and is honest about things that are hard to be honest about and does not make herself. Smaller than she is to make other people more comfortable. He paused. And because this kitchen has had a quality to it since the first morning that I would like it to keep. She looked at him. What are you asking? She said. He looked at her directly. I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the February wind was moving across the Wyoming flats with its flat, indifferent voice, and the fire was banked right the way she always banked it. And somewhere upstairs, Maisie was almost certainly sitting at the top of the stairs with her ear toward the door and no long division happening at all. Lenora looked at Silas Calder across the kitchen table, at the weather-cut lines of his face and the directness of his eyes and the quality he had of being exactly and only what he was, which was not a romantic quality but was a real one, and in her experience a rare one. She thought about the arithmetic. She had always thought about the arithmetic first, and she was not going to stop now because the question was a different kind than usual. The arithmetic here said she had $111 and a monthly wage and a household she had built and a small girl who had put her name in a ledger and a man who had paid his debt before he'd asked his question. The arithmetic said she was not in a position of need. This was not a decision made from desperation. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. She was sitting across from a man who was asking her something real, and she was sitting there as someone who could say yes because she wanted to and not because she had no other place to be. She had never had that before. Not once in 31 years had she had that. She thought about $11 in a boot and 6 miles of frozen road and a plate of cold beef from a small girl who had not yet been told that the decent thing and the practical thing were supposed to conflict. She thought about who she had been the morning she dragged that trunk through the gate and who she was sitting here now, with her wages in a proper place and her name in the ledger and a kitchen she knew down to the draft from the north window. She thought about the cup on the right shelf of the cabinet beside the ceramic one that hadn't been moved in 18 months, and what it meant that it was there and not on the left shelf where she had originally put it. Yes, she said, it was not dramatic. Neither of them was a dramatic person. Setzlows, Silas looked at her across the table with the expression of someone who had expected to have to negotiate harder and was processing the fact that he didn't have to, and she looked back at him with the expression of someone who has made a decision she has thought all the way through and arrived at the same place twice. Yes, she said again, I'll marry you. He put his hand on the table, not reaching for her, just putting it there, open on the table between them, which was Silas's version of a gesture and she put her hand over it, and they sat there for a moment in the kitchen of the ranch that was still standing because of the arithmetic they had worked through together on opposite sides of too many problems to count. The sound from the top of the stairs was not subtle. They both heard it at the same time. The creak of someone who had been sitting very still for too long and could not quite contain the shift in position anymore. Silas looked at the ceiling. "Maisie," he said. A pause. "Then I'm doing long division." "Come down," he said. Footsteps came down the stairs with the particular rhythm of someone who was trying to look like they had not been sitting there the whole time and was not quite managing it. Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightdress with her slate, which had nothing written on it at all. She looked at her father. She looked at Lenora. She looked at their hands on the table. Her face did the thing it did when she was working very hard not to let something show. She was not entirely successful. "Maisie," Lenora said, "come here." Maisie came to the table and stood beside her, and Lenora looked at her directly, the way she always did, because Maisie was the kind of child who deserved to be looked at directly. "If you have something to say," Lenora said, "say it." Maisie looked at her father, then at Lenora. "Are you going to stay?" she said. "For real this time. Not like before, where you could still leave." Lenora thought about how to answer this honestly, because honest was what Maisie required, and what she had always tried to give her. "I can still leave," she said. "That's always true. But I'm not going to." "How do you know?" "Because I have my wages and a choice," she said, "and I'm choosing to stay." "That's different from staying, because you don't have anywhere to go." Maisie thought about this with the serious evaluative expression she used for things she was genuinely working through. "Okay," she said. And then in a smaller voice, "I'm glad you came back from Mrs. Wexley's." "I know you are," Lenora said. "I'm glad too." They married in April on the ranch porch, which had been Lenora's preference because the alternative was the church in Dry Creek, and a church full of people who had watched her drag a trunk 6 miles down a frozen road and had not offered to help. And she had not quite forgiven the town for that, even though she understood it was not the kind of thing anyone would help with. The porch suited her. The porch was iron hollow. All 6 ranch hands were there. Reuben in a clean coat that appeared to have been kept for occasions. Dell with his hat held in both hands. Jake looking like a young man who was not accustomed to ceremonies and was trying to compensate by standing very straight. The other 3, Holt, Preston, and a quiet older man named Marcus, who rarely spoke, but always did his work, completely stood at the edge of the porch and were present in the solid, reliable way they were always present for things that needed them. It was not a long ceremony. Silas had asked a traveling judge who came through Dry Creek every 3rd month, and the judge did it in under 15 minutes with the efficiency of a man who had performed this function many times on ranches and understood that the people involved had animals to get back to. Maisie stood beside Lenora and held her hand during the whole thing. She had done Lenora's hair that morning, or attempted to. She had climbed onto the stool and worked at it with the comb, and the result was imperfect in specific ways that Lenora had noticed in the mirror and chosen not to correct, because Maisie had done it with the concentrated care of someone trying very hard to do a good thing, and a few imperfect pins were not going to ruin April. Reuben was the first to shake Silas's hand after the judge was done. He held it for a moment and said something quiet that Lenora didn't hear. And Silas nodded once, and whatever passed between them in that moment was the kind of thing that didn't need an audience. Dell said congratulations to Lenora with the same formality he used every evening at supper when he said thank you, which was the formality of a man who meant it and knew no other register for meaning it, and she accepted it with genuine warmth. Jake said, "Does this mean you're really not leaving?" and then looked immediately embarrassed at having said it, and Lenora told him that was correct, which made him look relieved in a way that told her something about what the morning she had walked out had been like she had walked out, for the people who'd found the cold kitchen. She had thought about that. She had thought about it more since coming back than she had while she was in the middle of deciding to go. What it had been like for 6 men to come in from a cold morning's work and find no fire, no food, no bell, and a note weighted down by a wrong cup. She understood, in a way she hadn't let herself fully understand at the time, that her leaving had not been only about her. When you became the center of something that mattered to people, your leaving mattered to them. That was not a reason not to go when going was the right thing. but it was a thing to know clearly. She knew it now. The afternoon of the wedding, when everyone had eaten and the judge had gone back to Dry Creek, and the hands had drifted back to their evening work, Lenora went into the kitchen to start supper and found the ledger on the table. Silas came in a few minutes later. He stood beside her at the table and opened it to the page. I can write these over, in ink, proper entries. She looked at Maisie's 11 pencil lines, the careful handwriting of a 7-year-old who had understood the principle before the adults did. The names of the weeks, the blank wage columns that now had Silas's ink numbers beside them, the whole record of a thing that had been wrong and then been made right. No, she said. He looked at her. Leave them, she said. Those are Maisie's. He looked at the page for a moment. Then he closed the ledger and left it on the table. She went back to supper. Later that spring, she took 2 hooks and put them in the kitchen wall beside the cabinet. She moved the ceramic cup from the inside shelf to one of the hooks, and she put her tin cup on the second hook, and she found a third hook small, set lower, at the height of a 7-year-old's reach, and she put nothing on it yet. Maisie found them on a Tuesday morning. She stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the 3 hooks, 2 with cups and 1 empty, and she looked at Lenora. That one's mine, she said. When you find a cup you want, Lenora said. Goes. Maisie looked at the low hook for a long time. Can I pick any cup you want, even a fancy one? If you want a fancy one. Maisie considered this with the gravity she applied to things that were genuinely important to her. Then she went to the cabinet and looked at the ranch cups for a while, and then she turned and went upstairs, and Lenora heard her in her room, and she came back down, holding a small tin cup, not a ranch cup, but one she had apparently had in her room for some time, or found somewhere, small enough to fit a child's hand easily. Carried it to the hook. She hung it there. She stepped back and looked at all 3. It's us, Maisie said. That's us, Lenora agreed. The spring went the way hard springs do not easily, but forward. The April accounting with the bank was tense, conducted across a desk in Dry Creek by a man who preferred numbers to people, and had no particular interest in the human story behind them, but the numbers that Lenora had been building into the household accounts since October told their own story, Skolmer Tolton's story. And that story was legible even to a man who didn't care about it. Operating costs down by more than 1/3 over the same quarter of the previous year. Purchasing accounts restructured, flour contract in place and running. No unpaid household debts. The bank extended the arrangement through the end of the year. Silas came home from that meeting in better condition than he had come home from the January one. He sat at the kitchen table and put the papers down and looked at them for a moment and then looked at Lenora. Year extension, he said. Full accounting again in January. Good, she said. We'll be ready. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his versions of being moved by something not visible emotion, but a quality of heightened attention, the way he looked at things he wanted to hold on to. The savings records you've been keeping, he said. Count books. They convinced him. The savings convinced him, she said. The records just showed him what was already true. It's the same thing. Not quite, she said. The truth has to exist first. The records just make it visible. He thought about that. You're right, he said. By summer, Iron Hollow had the specific quality that places get when they've been through something hard and come out the other side still intact, not comfortable. Exactly. Not easy, but settled in a way that felt earned rather than given. The 280 cattle were in better health than the 400 had been, because a smaller herd managed tightly was a different thing than a larger one managed under the pressure of debt and distraction. Reuben had pointed this out in May, in his way, by saying simply that the animals looked better, which, from Reuben, was the equivalent of a full report. The hands had changed in ways that were still small, but had accumulated into something real. They worked with a cohesion that hadn't been there before, not because anything dramatic had happened to create it, but because 11 weeks of better food and a running household, and someone who managed the kitchen like it mattered, had shifted something in the daily texture of their lives. Dell had started helping Maisie with the things on the high shelves without being asked. Jake had taken over the firewood inside the door as a standing task that he simply did every day without discussion. Holt had begun reporting minor maintenance issues to Lenora, as well as to Silas, which he had apparently decided was sensible given that she was the person most likely to know whether a leaking cold room shelf had affected the preserved food. Reuben said nothing about any of this. Reuben simply existed in the ranch's daily life, the way he had always existed in it steadily. Without theater, like someone who had always understood what the place could be and was waiting patiently for everyone else to arrive at the same understanding. Maisie got her cup from a peddler who came through Dry Creek in July, a small blue ceramic cup, not fancy by any standard anyone else would apply, but blue was Maisie's color, the one she'd wanted ribbon of in the dry goods store that day, back in November, and she carried it home from town with both hands and hung it on the low hook, and stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has completed something. Lenora looked at it beside the other two. 3 cups on 3 hooks. One for what had been, one for what was, one for what was still becoming. She had not planned it that way when she put the hooks up. She had put the hooks up because the shelf inside the cabinet felt wrong. The ceramic cup didn't belong on the inside, where no one could see it. It belonged in the light, where it was visible, where it could be acknowledged as the thing it was, a record of a woman who had been here and mattered, and whose being here had not stopped mattering just because she was gone. But looking at the 3 cups, she understood that she had done something right by instinct, that she could not have described in advance. Kept the record. You didn't erase it and start over, didn't replace it with something cleaner or more comfortable. You kept the record and you added to it, because that was how you honored both the people who came before and the people who were here now by refusing to make them compete with each other for space on the wall. That was something she understood from kitchens. A kitchen was never just one person. It was everyone who had cooked in it, layer on layer, and the wisdom was in knowing which layers to keep and which problems to fix and how to tell the difference between the two. The ledger stayed on the shelf in Silas's study through that year, and the next and the one after that, until the study became too small its contents, and things were reorganized, and the ledger ended up in the kitchen on the shelf beside the window, where the light was good, and where anyone sitting at the table could see it. Nobody moved it after that. Maisie grew old enough to ring the kitchen bell herself without the stool, and then old enough that she rang it out of habit more than necessity, and then old enough that she rang it because it was the signal the ranch ran on. And she was old enough to understand what signals meant and why they mattered. The hands stopped when they heard it. They stopped because the bell meant the meal was ready and the day's middle was marked. And there was a kitchen to come in from the cold too. Once, Lenora had rung it for the first time in the first week as a practical solution to a practical problem. How do you call 6 men in from a large property when you need them at the table? Later, after the day it had been silent, after the 6 men had come in from the cold to find no fire and no food, and a note waited by a wrong cup, the bell meant something it had not meant before. It meant someone is here. Someone is in the kitchen. The day has a center. That was not nothing. That was, in the accounting Lenora kept in her own head, the one that was not in any ledger, because it was not that kind of number everything. She had come to Iron Hollow with $11 and a burned letter and a trunk that caught on every rut in a frozen road. She had worked 11 weeks without wages and made the only decision she knew how to make, which was the honest one, and then she had made it again from the other side of it, with money in her hand and the actual freedom that money represented. She had not come here looking for a home. She had been looking for wages, for security, for the ordinary decent things a working woman was owed and had not been given. She had built those things first, which was the only order in which they could be built, and the rest of it had grown in the space that was left over after the arithmetic was settled. That was the truth of it. Not a story about rescue or sentiment or the softening of hard edges into something easier. A story about a woman who understood the difference between a promise and a wage, who waited until she had the wage and the choice before she let herself choose, and who chose with her eyes open, with her money counted, with the 11 pencil lines in the ledger, and the 3 cups on the hooks, and the kitchen bell in her hand to stay. The ranch survived, not easily, not without more hard winters and difficult numbers, and the continuing company of a bank that had no interest in anyone's story beyond the figure that told it. But it survived, year after year, because the woman running its household understood that survival was arithmetic, and also more than arithmetic, and that the more than arithmetic part only worked when the arithmetic was solid first. Every day before noon the bell rang. Across Iron Hollow, the men in the fields heard it, and the man in the barn heard it, and the girl who grew up to be someone who knew the worth of a working woman heard it, and they all moved toward the kitchen, the way people move toward warmth when they know it will be there. It was always there. She made sure of it.